Okay, let's move on from the Game Awards towards just a bit of extra content that we had to cover. Obviously, a couple of weeks back, we looked at Avatar Frontiers of Pandora on PlayStation 5 Professional and were not particularly happy with the results because the PSSR implementation, arguably worse in quality
Yes,
terms
sir.
than the existing FSR2 version on the base machine. Pro machine shouldn't be worse than the base machine in any sort of metric. It looks like Ubisoft Massive has reacted to the criticism. There are patches for both Avatar Frontiers of Pandora and Star Wars Outlaws, which also had some pretty profound PSSR issues. And Oliver, you took a look at them for us, and it's quite an interesting solution they've come up with, right?
Yes, it is interesting. I'll start here with Avatar, because that game I think is maybe more pressing in terms of some of the issues that were introduced. But they've essentially added 4 discrete modes here. A quality mode at 30 FPS, a quality mode at 60 FPS, a performance mode, and a quality mode at 40 FPS, plus a PSSR and FSR toggles. That's basically 8 full mode variations here, which is quite a few.
Wow.
But I decided here to simplify things by starting off with a performance mode and some simple PSSR and FSR comparisons, because I think that's probably the starting point for a lot of players. If they are digging through these menus, like what's the best reconstruction solution to play on PS5 Pro? So I'll spoil it. I think the answer is pretty clearly FSR for a few reasons. Number one, it doesn't exhibit the same lighting denoising issues we see with PSSR. So basically any area of the image that is lit predominantly by the RTGI in particular can look pretty ugly with PSSR. That's basically areas that are in shadow. With PSSR, those areas look very unstable looking. With FSR, it's not perfect, but it is more consistent and more stable, especially in stills. It's a pretty common fault we see with PSSR in certain games. Can also show up a little bit with the SSR, particularly at far distances, where the PSSR is giving you a more noisy, less stable SSR resolve there. The second issue I'd say is just PSSR's kind of fundamental lack of coherency, for lack of a better term. Like, it's that strange noise and softness you get across the entire image, even parts of the image where the lighting is very direct. It's really noisy, almost like there's this film grain effect that you can't turn off, but like a really kind of ugly looking film grain that's kind of warping the image underneath. FSR doesn't have this issue and looks sharper in head-to-heads. So both those issues are noticeable at rest and during movement. I don't think it's worth getting into like a point-by-point comparison here because those issues just stand out and make PSSR look pretty bad at times. FSR is just delivering a better result. There are areas where PSSR can be better, like it's sharper during movement, as we see in some other games with PSSR, but on the whole, I think FSR 3 is just better. But of course, we have those 4 visual modes on PS5 Pro here. So there are 3 quality mode variants, like I said, 30, 40, 60, and a performance mode variant, which is 60 FPS. So one difference between the quality modes seemingly universally and the performance mode is the quality mode appears to run with higher visual settings. So the foliage here draws out a little bit further across all the quality modes, for instance, even the 60 FPS quality mode, as far as I can tell. So it suggests that these are operating with the quality mode settings there. The key difference in my eyes is image quality. The quality 60 FPS and performance 60 FPS look pretty similar to me, but the quality 30 FPS mode looks a lot sharper. It's much clearer, especially when using PSSR. It exhibits those issues to a lesser degree, I would say. I did some pixel counts here, quick pixel counts, and the performance mode and quality 60 modes were hanging around 900p, 1152p, counts in that range with PSSR, while the quality 30 mode was like 1512p, 1800p, counts like that, so higher res. In that case, I also did some comparisons with the PS5 version in performance mode and the Pro version in performance mode with FSR3 for a bit of like-to-like comparisons. And in one shot that I got, it looks like the Pro is clearer, sharper, more temporally stable. Internally, the base machine in this shot is 720p and the Pro is about 936p. 720p basically being the lowest on the resolution scale that Avatar can go on PS5. I did some other comparison shots, but Avatar has certain like fog and haze effects that got in the way, making one platform look unusually soft relative to the other. So this is the one that I got that actually looked pretty similar in both machines in terms of the atmospheric rendering. Lastly, with Avatar, oh boy, I took a look at performance. In the base game, it's kind of like 60 FPS roughly in performance mode, but it does drop some frames there periodically. And here, it's basically the same situation. Not sure whether that's from CPU limitations or dynamic res flow that's too aggressive, or just spikes in GPU load that the dynamic res is not 100% catching up with. The performance mode seems to run better than the quality mode at 60 FPS, which dropped more frequently in my tests. And they do have some tearing in the top portion of the screen when they drop frames, which was the same behavior we saw on PS5. The quality mode at 30 FPS, unsurprisingly, though I did test that, it does basically run at 30. So for Star Wars Outlaws, it's pretty similar in terms of the PSSR versus FSR breakdown there, which is not surprising, given that it's the same engine, same developer, less than a year apart there. It's pretty similar in a lot of respects, technology-wise, I'd have to assume. But it's also quite different in terms of the content. I think that Outlaws has, generally speaking, worse image quality than Avatar, on consoles especially. Those wide open fields of grass really aren't suited well to either technique, but in my analysis here, PSSR kind of looks worse. It looks blurry and noisy at the same time, whereas FSR just kind of looks like FSR. You get those salt and pepper artifacts, but it looks reasonably sharp and sort of clear. But the Outlaws does interestingly have some very noisy ray traced lighting, especially in small scale environments. That's a problem with FSR and PSSR. But FSR is definitely a little bit better here again. PSSR shows more obvious noise, and the lighting doesn't really cohere as well, though neither technique is really perfect. I think you need to kick things up to basically quality mode before you start to get a really stable RT lighting presentation in some of those smaller scale environments, which is a unique issue in Star Wars Outlaws, and like the cantina here, or when we're kind of going around the various markets and stalls here, it's definitely a constant problem on both machines in performance mode. And then on top of those issues, PSSR is just generally softer and less stable and noisier regardless of what kind of content is on screen. Performance is basically the same as Avatar, as far as I can tell. One-off drop frames here and there, nothing huge. So overall here, it's good that Massive has added FSR back into the mix. But I do have to say that I'm not a big fan of the way the games are configured now, especially for new players or players who will just stick to the defaults, because there are a lot of different modes. Though I know players have different opinions on that. I'm not going to get into that here. I think probably the performance 60 FPS and quality 60 FPS modes are pretty duplicative of each other, but that's not that big of an issue. For me, the issue here is just giving players that choice between FSR and PSSR. I think FSR is clearly better, and by a good enough margin in these titles, that I don't think you want to give players that choice. I think you just want to give them FSR instead of giving them that opportunity to have a worse visual experience, in my opinion. I understand there's probably a political element to that. I also understand there's probably an element where you've given an option to players. It's kind of hard to then take it away. But I think the approach taken by Bloober with Silent Hill 2 is a bit better, where they just replaced it with their old anti-aliasing and reconstruction solution and not really thought too hard about it. I think if you are going to give players all these modes, they kind of have to represent legitimate trade-offs here. And even in a game like GT7 or Spider-Man 2, which John took a look at both those games on PS5 Pro, all those toggles kind of make sense and kind of do their own things in their own context, and maybe you would want to have certain toggles enabled or disabled. In particular, in GT7, the choice between their TAA and PSSR presents different trade-offs in terms of image quality and performance that are pretty legitimate trade-offs there, especially with the RT. But that's not the case here. So that's not going to be an issue for me or John or Rich. It might be an issue for a lot of players who just are not well-versed or have not done the research, and who probably will just stick with the defaults. I think one of the games defaulted to PSSR and the other defaulted to FSR3 upon my first boot. So it does not seem like there's too much of a rhyme or reason there necessarily, which is unfortunate. So yeah, just my thoughts on it. I'm glad they've gone back to the old AA solution potentially. Not ideal 100%, but it is definitely a big step in the right direction, at least until they do promise that they're going to be working on their PSSR implementation here possibly. If that can be improved, obviously that would be a nice outcome, but for now FSR is perfectly fine, I think.
Right, so just the mode you recommend for each game, which one is it?
Probably for VSync, Performance 60, or I shouldn't say Performance 60, it's just Performance.
Right.
to me, that's good, especially in Avatar. In Star Wars Outlaws, there's more of a trade-off where you go to like quality 30 or maybe quality 40, and you are getting a better lighting presentation, substantially better lighting presentation. That's more my concern there. If you don't have, if you do have a VRR display and you do have that enabled, try quality 60. It does drop a little bit more. Maybe you could notice some of the differences, but to me, the differences in terms of image settings there, in terms of visual settings, seem pretty minimal. Like, you're not going to notice a little bit of extended grass draw distance, especially with the image quality issues the game already has with distant foliage and things like that. So just kind of my recommendation there.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting thing, right? Because obviously it's great that choice has been returned to the user and there are palpable advantages to the patch, right? But at the same time, it's kind of like a holding pattern, isn't it? It's basically, right, okay, there's an issue here. We're just going to give all of the options to you and you can basically decide what you think is best, which on the one hand is great. And I guess it works for a pro console, which should have a more enthusiast level audience, I guess. But at the same time, you kind of do want the developer to guide you towards the best solution at the very least, right? I think that's your continuing point about the proliferation of different modes in console games. Yeah. Okay. Good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy. I'm happy if they want to ship different modes, especially to suit different kinds of display types and different kinds of FPS targets. I think the way they've configured these games, typically with modes, makes a lot of sense. It's just now we throw in an anti-aliasing and reconstruction solution that in my mind is clearly not up to the task of actually delivering a stable and coherent image in these games that do rely so heavily on ray trace lighting. Like, it's easy to forget, but these are games that are really heavily ray tracing their lighting for console games in particular. You kind of need the upsampler to help you there in terms of getting that image looking coherent and stable over multiple frames. That's something that PSSR at the moment is not doing. So that is really critical here, giving players the opportunity to kind of disrupt that fundamental lighting presentation with PSSR. I think it's a bad idea, personally. My own personal opinion.
Yeah.
I understand there are factors here, but I think you should remove it.
Yeah, there is kind of like a three horsemen of the apocalypse when it comes to PSSR, which is like foliage, ray tracing, and low resolution. And those three horsemen are all present and correct in these two games. And lo and behold, it's not producing great results. But, you know, at least there is now a mitigation in place, which I think is probably the best way forward in the short term.